If you've had your eyes open at any stage over the past weekend, you'll have noticed an open beta for a game called Mortal Shell has been doing the rounds. It ended on the 13th, and I gave it a lash to see what it was about. From developer Cold Symmetry is a game that's pretty much Dark Souls with some trimmings. Those trimmings namely being characterization and story. There's not a whole lot to be gleaned about this game from a beta you could get through in under 2 hours, even if you're not a Dark Souls fan. So there's no threat of any spoilers, and players can be shown the basic mechanics and be given a sniff of the future story. Mortal Shell wears its Dark Souls influences on both its sleeves and has them tattooed onto its forehead. In fact, were it not for the curious method of developing different characters, I'd suggest Mortal Shell was downright plagiarism. Firstly, you're introduced to the faceless, nameless avatar you'll be controlling called the Foundling. After 2 short areas of tutorials, you're tossed into a boss fight immediately. Sound familiar? Then a bell rings, the boss teleports away, and you're eaten by a giant fish that's somehow swimming in ankle-high water. Yeah. From here you're tossed into an area called Fallgrim and introduced to your first shell, Haros, a knight-style character. Down below there are 2 bandits playing some loot and having a barbecue. When you arrive, they decide to try and kill you. And it's here the mechanic of parrying is introduced. Yes, you can't parry through any form of skill or technique, it's a magical field that enables this, nothing else. It also introduces another mechanic lifted straight out of a From Software game, ripostes. They're called Visceral Attacks in Bloodborne. These special moves require resolve, which is charged up by attacking enemies constantly. Making your way through Fallgrim will introduce you to a number of concepts like traps, ranged enemies and spear-wielding enemies. It also firmly sets the tone for the combat for the rest of the beta. Unless you're reckless, you'll never be fighting any more than 2 enemies, which is handy because often 2 is more than enough, given that your character will rarely survive more than 2 or 3 direct hits. Moving through Fallgrim will lead you to the abandoned crypts. Here we get introduced to more of the story elements. We meet Sister Ganessa, who holds the key to unlocking the potential of our shells, or in other words, the RPG elements to the game. In unlocking the other abilities of the shells, we also unlock more information about who they were prior to becoming the flesh puppet that we see before us. We unlock abilities to buy things using 2 currencies, tar, short for nectar, and glimpses. Tar is your generic coin stand-in, whereas glimpses are something a little bit different. You'll only ever get them for killing the bigger monsters or a certain type of monster for the first time. It's a clever way of implementing a sort of anti-farming. You can just rinse and repeat the lower level jobbers, but without glimpses, you won't be able to unlock any of the higher tier abilities. It's also in the crypt level that we get our second shell, Teal, the thief style character, plus a new weapon, the hammer and chisel. The thief shell seems to have some prior with Sister Ganessa, which is interesting. Making our way through this area, we'll get to the boss. True to form, it's a huge creature with swords for arms and a cage on its head. It utilises nothing but area sweep attacks and unblockable charge attacks, along with some help from falling stalactites. When this boss is dead, we progress and the demo will end. So that's the beta. But how is it? First off, the graphics are great, it has to be said. The level of detail is excellent and the crisp models look wonderful and the landscapes really set the tone of the levels. The level design, or limited amount of it, is pretty good, giving the area a weird blend of open world and arena at the same time. There aren't too many voice acted characters in the beta, but the few that are all wonderfully well done. The sound design is spot on as well, leading the levels to seem really fleshed out and real. Since this game is so reminiscent of the Souls series, it'd be an easier job describing it by stating all the things that aren't similar. We've already mentioned the currency and leveling mechanics, but the real meat of the differences lie in a few areas: story, characterization, and combat. As far as the combat goes, there's not a huge amount of difference, but the little there is quite pointed. Namely, the chief difference is the ability to harden. Harden is where you turn your character to stone for a brief period, enabling them to shrug off attacks, even unblockable ones. The key point is that you can harden mid-combo to throw your opponent off, meaning you can throw the first two moves of a combo, harden midway through your final strike, no-sell the enemy attack, and then unharden to complete the combo. The use of this definitely adds an interesting dimension to the combat. The cooldown period is long enough to prevent spamming, and the move does seem balanced enough to ensure that it doesn't totally nerf the combat. My main issue with the combat is it's curiously both sluggish and floaty. You never really feel like you're in control of the character, you just sort of hit buttons in the hope that your attack lands. It's weird, it's like you're not fighting in real time, it's like you're fighting in a choose your own adventure book. Each move takes an absolute age to wind up and execute, it's like they're moving in slow motion. I always get really worried when designers use the term deliberate when describing combat, as if most games just have their characters accidentally fight each other. What they mean by deliberate is slow, and the combat in Mortal Shell is slow. There's a curious group of thought that this kind of weighty controls on display portray realism or make the combat more visceral. It does neither of these things. Most of the time, you trigger the attack, then smash the dodge button for the entire animation, hoping to dodge whatever counter the enemy does. Usually you'll be aiming to hit and stagger the enemy before they can properly trigger their fight animation. The most common method of getting hit is the enemy simply no-selling your hit with their combo, breezing through your attack and hitting you. And getting hit is a big deal in Mortal Shell. In the same vein that Bloodborne looked at Dark Souls and removed the shields, Mortal Shell has looked at Dark Souls and thought, let's remove the shields. Oh, and those Estus flask things, yeah, let's get rid of them as well. As far as this beta shows, there's no real item for healing. Throughout the whole thing, you can only heal through some red mushrooms, which you can occasionally find around the place and respawn after a while. A cooked rat item that gets dropped very seldom by enemies, and a baguette item that I was only able to find one of in a locked chest of all places. And the empowered riposte will restore some health. It's worth remembering that all of these bar the riposte heal you very slowly and need to be used a number of times to build up their familiarity before they'll become in any way effective for combat. There are also abilities that the shells can have for health, whereby picking up glimpses might restore a bit of health, or one where getting poisoned will end up healing you rather than hurting you, but these aren't the most useful and they require you to get into combat to even be used. Getting hurt in Mortal Shell really hurts. It's not pathologic levels of suck, but it's not far off. Another difference is the items in the inventory. Items are picked up and are only given a very cursory description at first. Each item has a familiarity bar which can be increased using multiples of the item until it's maxed out, and then it can be used as intended. The key item to demonstrate this is the loot. At first, your character can't play for shit. Give it 10 do-overs and he's rocking it to the point where enemies will go out of their way to attack you. Hate it. The main unique factor to Mortal Shell is the shells themselves. You're only given 2 in the beta, but already I'm seriously intrigued as to how they'll incorporate a disparate group of characters into the sparse storyline they intend to tell. It looks as though they're going with the Dark Souls method of giving the merest scraps of lore and nothing else to flesh the world out. Now we have a number of strands to tug at throughout the game, and tying the storylines directly to the character leveling is an unusual move, but one that could really pay dividends if it's done right. In the end, I actually enjoyed myself on this beta. Even though Souls games like these are resolutely not my cup of tea, I found myself giving a shit about the shells and their former lives. How did they come to be here? What's up with Teal and Sister Ganessa? How did Haros become a knight when he's got fuck all knowledge of how to swing a sword? All will be revealed later on in the year on Epic and early next year on Steam. If you're a Dark Souls fan, then believe me, this is so far up your alley it's tickling your kidneys. While I am impressed enough by the beta to probably buy the game when it drops, I can see that the designers have made no attempt whatsoever to appeal to anyone who isn't a fan of this style of game. If you're not, and you missed out on the beta, then it's a solid try before you buy.